How you doing there, eighth grade? This is Mr. Garnett Cook. I am experimenting with Screencastify, which is a handy app for uh, doing presentations in a recorded format. I've never used it before, so this is my first crack at it. I thought I would use it to take some time to answer some of the questions that you asked for one of the assignments this week. I asked you to look at some immigration statistics and brainstorm some questions. A lot of you asked some really good questions, so I have included some in this presentation. I will go through them one at a time, and I'm going to answer them as best as I am able to. One of the questions that several people actually asked was why the year 1991 had the largest number of immigrants come to the US. Well, it's an interesting statistic. If you actually look at the numbers, you'll notice that the numbers started climbing in 1989, 1990, and 1991. Now, part of the reason for that isn't that new people were coming into the country, but there were people who, during those years, because of a law passed in 1986, were able to apply for legal status. And once that happened, they started being included among the number of legal immigrants living in the United States. And that was a big contributor to why the number started to grow during those years. A lot of you asked that question. It was a good eye on your part. I believe it's still the largest number in any year was 1991. I'll have more to say about that in a second. One of you asked, why weren't people coming to the USA in the 1940s? I would think that America would be a safe haven during the war. A couple of people asked a question about that. Well, one of the simple reasons is war. During the war, there were, among other things, enemy submarines that were patrolling the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, and so it made travel by ship, which was still the dominant mode of travel for people immigrating here from other countries, and made travel by ship really challenging. So that was one reason. The other factor, and this is something that maybe will come up in a future screencast perhaps, the United States in the war still had very strict quotas, strict limits on the number of people who were going to be let into the country. And because of that, even some people fleeing Nazi occupied Europe during the war were denied entry into the United States. So those are a couple of the big factors that explain why the numbers were low during World War II. One of you asked, what was the average amount of immigrants coming into the U.S. Now versus the past? A really good question. If you look at the immigration statistics on that sheet, you'll notice that the first decade of the 20th century was a peak period for immigration to this country. And the key thing you have to remember is the number of people who are coming as a percentage of the total population. So, for example, the year with the largest total number of people coming in was 1991. But if I remember correctly, the total population of the country at that point was somewhere around 250 million people. Now, by comparison, in the first decade of the 20th century, when you also had numbers over a million, the population of the country at that point was somewhere around 90 to 100 million. So although the total number in 1991 was higher, as a percentage of the total population, it was lower relative to the total population. So the number of immigrants coming in the early 20th century are having a much more transformative impact because they're a much larger percentage of the overall population. So that's a really good question. One of you wondered how different the numbers would look if it included illegal immigrants. First of all, this is one of those terms. Some people prefer undocumented immigrants. Some people prefer illegal immigrant. You could use either one. It is kind of a political thing, which term you use. It's very difficult to know how different the numbers would be. There was a guy who I took an immigration course with years ago who said something to me that you can't have, quote, illegal immigrants unless you have laws. And for a long time in American history, whether or not you were allowed into this country was based on your ability to pay to come here. There were very few laws that placed barriers on who could enter the United States. So through most of, for instance, the 18th and 19th century, the concept of illegal immigrants simply didn't exist. And then the late 19th century, and then especially into the 20th century, there were a lot of new laws being passed that placed barriers on who could come into the country. And so this concept of what we would call illegal immigration really did not come into existence till the 20th century. As a political issue, it really has only been a major political issue, I would say, since the 1980s. There are a lot of complicated reasons for that, which maybe can be brought up at another time. It's very difficult to know what the numbers would look like because it's very difficult to count the number of people living here illegally. It's estimated today that there are probably somewhere around 10 to 11 million people in the United States currently who are not living here legally. But it's very hard to count because, people who are not here legally are certainly not advertising the fact that they're here. So it's very difficult to answer that question. That was a really good question. Um, Over the years, which country had the most people immigrating to the United States? I believe it is still Germany. I believe somewhere around 6.5 million people immigrated here from Germany over the entire history of immigration. I believe the United Kingdom is number two. Europe overall is still the number one uh, place of origin for people who came to this country historically, although that has not been true since 1965. I put a video up on announcements, a really cool animation that you can watch how immigration has changed over time. And since 1965, which was when what was known as the Hart-Celler Act was passed, which lifted a lot of the quotas and restrictions on who could come here, you're seeing a lot more people coming here from Asia, East Asia in particular, China, Japan, Korea, Southeast Asia, a lot of people coming from Africa, a lot of people coming from the Caribbean, a lot of people coming from Latin America. And that has really changed the face of immigration over the last 50 years. So since 1965, it's definitely not Europe. But if you look at the entire history of immigration, it's Europe. And I believe Germany overall, historically, is still number one. One of you wondered if some of the drops in numbers are caused by new laws that kept immigrants out of the United States. The short answer to that question is yes. Now, probably the week after next, I'm going to be giving you a short reading on the history of Ellis Island. And from 1890 to 1920, Ellis Island processed approximately 60 to 70% of people who immigrated here from Europe. And there were laws that governed how people were processed at Ellis Island. And actually, one of the things you'll learn is that Ellis Island was actually created for the purpose of trying to get control over who could enter the country. Now, having said that, over the entire history of Ellis Island, only about 2% of people were denied entry to the country entirely. So you'll notice that, from 1890 to 1910, immigration actually increases. The biggest change was in the 1920s after World War I, when the United States set up what was called the quota system. You saw huge drops after 1924, especially in the number of people coming in, and that was because of the very restrictive laws that were passed in the 20s that limited who could come here. One of you asked, why is it that as time goes on, more and more acts are passed, there are immigrants still coming in? Well, I sort of answered that question already. One of the things that you're going to have to remember about immigration is that whether or not the U.S. has a more open immigration process, or what some people call more open borders, has to do to a large degree with the demand for immigrant labor. If you look historically, for example, immigrants filled a lot of jobs in the United States, and so there was great demand. So even though there were laws, there was still a desire to bring immigrant workers into the country. And to some degree, that remains true to this day. Immigration law is very complicated. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on it. There are people out there who are. But it is possible to have laws that govern who can come here and under what conditions, and still have large numbers of people coming into the country. One of you asked, why has immigration declined in recent years? Well, that's an interesting question. The short answer to that question is it hasn't. I mean, yes, no. I mean, there's a perception, particularly since the Trump administration came to power, that the number of people coming in has dropped dramatically. Now, I don't know what the numbers were for 2019, but from 2015 to 2018, we were still letting in 1 million or more people a year. So it's not as if there has been this dramatic drop. There was, after 9/11, greater restrictions placed on who could enter the country, particularly from specific nations. And you still see that with the Trump administration, what is famously known as the travel ban, this denial of entry into the country from specific nations. But the United States is still letting in a lot of immigrants. So the idea that we're sort of shut the door, not necessarily true, although there are certainly tougher policies, since Trump became president than there were before. Anyway, those are some of your questions. I'll be doing another screencast where I talk about some other issues, big picture stuff related to immigration. I hope I was able to answer some of your questions, and hopefully you liked my very first ever screencast. Anyway, I will talk to y'all soon.